All right, good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to make some assumptions off the bat that you're attending today if you have some requirement to learn about asbestos or implement asbestos management plans or assessments in your facilities. If you're interested in asbestos or you just have a little bit of time to kill. But either way, I appreciate you spending the hour with me, and I'm hoping that you leave this session with some takeaways. So I'll start with an introduction about myself. So my name is Tanya. I am an operations manager in the hazardous building materials group in the Greater Toronto area at Pynchon. So my office locations are Mississauga, Toronto, Oshawa, and Peterborough. I put up my contact information here on the screen for you. If you do have any questions, comments, or want to chat about your facilities after the presentation, I would be more than happy. So if you just want to take a moment and jot down my information, this seminar will be available as well. It's being recorded. So if you do want to watch it thereafter or want to grab my contact information after this as well, feel free. So I've been at Pynchon for about 8 years. I've been doing this for just over 13 in the industry. I started as a field technician and kind of made my way up to the operations manager for GTA. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Pynchon. So Pynchon now has over 1,000 staff members, and we span over 50 offices across Canada, and now most recently over into the US. So over the last 2 years, we've actually been working on acquisitions in the US to expand our services in that US market. So we offer a wide range of services. So in addition to my specialty, which is hazardous materials, and specifically asbestos to this seminar, Pynchon offers a lot of different services from training, environmental due diligence services. So that's your phase ones, phase twos, which support buying and selling of land. We have a lot of geotechnical engineering services, indoor air quality assessment services. So just to name a few, if you're not sure if we provide that service, reach out, ask me, and more times than not, I'm sure that we can help service you with regards to environmental or engineering needs. So you had a brief overview on the course description of what this seminar will entail or include. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on asbestos, a bit of a quick asbestos awareness. I'll talk about, and I always say it's the driest part of the presentation, but again, secondary to the health component, it's most important to know the regulatory requirements. So I'm based in Ontario, and we may have some attendees today from different provinces across Canada. I will specifically talk about Ontario, but also make reference to other provinces and where certain requirements may vary or differ from Ontario to Quebec to BC, for example. I'll talk about responsibilities as the owner or property manager or maintenance staff for commercial real estate. Go into some of the details of asbestos assessments versus reassessments and what's required for the practicality of actually completing and carrying out that work and getting that documentation in place to make sure that you're in compliance. And then I'll talk about asbestos management plans, what's required, what's included, and how to actually carry them out and implement them in commercial real estate that you're either managing or owning. I will state again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. There will be a brief period of time at the end for open questions that you can post in the chat, and hopefully I'll be able to answer those for you. All right, so I'm going to start just with a little bit of an asbestos awareness, properties and uses of asbestos. So the most commonly talked about designated substance is asbestos. So there are other designated substances, or I'll call them DSSs, that are also a regulatory requirement separate than asbestos, but this one's the most popular and what we're talking about today. So we all hear about it, we all know about it, but do we really know what it is? So asbestos is naturally occurring. That means it's not man-made. So it's formed under a combination of a perfect temperature and moisture conditions over a long period of time. And that ultimately causes what we call minerals or asbestos to become fibrous. So the way that we get asbestos and can use it for building construction is through mining and milling processes. And they're used in order to obtain actual fibers from the ore itself. So there's different types of asbestos or minerals, and the most commonly type of asbestos that you will see is chrysotile. But there are other types of minerals that comprise the term asbestos. So there's 6 in total. There's, for example, amosite, tremolite, acrylonite, and again, most commonly, chrysotile. So asbestos was extensively used, primarily 1900s to 1970s, and then production began to slow a little bit. I'll talk about the different types of asbestos, but generally speaking, friable asbestos was banned from being installed and used in building construction in '86. And non-friables had varying dates of end of use. So an example is joint compound was banned in the 1980s. We used a cutoff date of '86 to be on the safe side, because if you maybe know in some of your buildings, you'll have extra material or replacement material that kind of sits in maintenance room or janitorial areas that may be pulled out years later and used to do repairs or install new ceiling systems. So by giving that buffer zone of 6 years, that's a safe cutoff date, for example, for joint compound. What may surprise a lot of you actually is that some non-friable materials were actually used up until the late 2018. So if you do have a newer building, you may say, well, I don't need to do this. It doesn't apply to my building because it was constructed in the 2000s, when in fact, there still is that requirement, which I'll talk about, the regulatory requirement to have these assessments and management plans if asbestos is found. So this is just a picture, a little video that's been playing of how asbestos looks. So I always say, it's a really great material, and this is a close-up of asbestos fibers in its raw form. So a fiber itself is actually defined as a particle that has specific diameter, and ratios. So it has a length to width ratio, which is about 3:1, and it has to be at least 5 micrometers in length. So these are two of the many counting criteria when accredited labs analyze materials for asbestos. There's a whole slew of other components that define asbestos fibers under the microscope, but generally speaking, 3:1 ratio and at least 5 micrometers long. So in Ontario specifically, and it does differ slightly province to province, but in Ontario, an asbestos-containing material, and I'll say ACM throughout this presentation because ACM is short for asbestos-containing material, a bit easier to say, is 0.5% or more asbestos fibers by dry weight. So you can't tell with the naked eye. It does have to go under microscopic analysis in order to determine the percentage of asbestos if present. So anything resulting 0.5% or higher is defined as asbestos in Ontario. That said, if you do have a material that has 0.5% or 80%, it doesn't matter. It's still defined as an ACM and has to be treated as such. So I love to include this slide because it's actual ads or examples of how asbestos was previously or historically used. Probably one of my favorite ones and most known example is The Wizard of Oz. So this is an example of a scene from that movie, and they actually used raw asbestos, so white powder that was asbestos fibers, and sprinkled it over the staff members in the set to simulate snow. Another example is they used to put asbestos fibers in the filters of cigarettes. And if you know, smoking significantly or exponentially increases your exposure and risk to long-term health effects related to asbestos. So they always say if you're a worker in a asbestos abatement work area and you're smoking, that significantly increases your likelihood of developing a related illness. So in the past, of course, they didn't know this and they put them in the filters of cigarettes. They also used to market it as a great family household material. So the construction of homes, so the siding on a house, or using it as insulation, thermal insulation in between the walls of homes. So these are actual ads and uses of asbestos. Back then they said it's a great material, and I still stand by that. It's a great material if it's left intact and undisturbed. If it's servicing its function and it's still in good condition, I always say it's a great material. But as soon as it becomes damaged or airborne, that's when it becomes a problem. So I've got a little video here, and I mentioned that there's two main categories of asbestos. So there's friable and non-friable. So this is an example of a friable material. Here you can visibly see some of the asbestos fibers in this material. So it's mixed with a binding agent, which is that white cementitious material between the fibers. So basically a friable material is something that can be crushed or pulverized or easily become powder with simple hand pressure, and then it becomes respirable or airborne. So I mentioned before the official cutoff date or when it was banned from installation for friable materials is 1986. Vermiculite is a little bit of an exception. So vermiculite is a loose fill insulation. I actually have a photo later in this presentation of it. But that was specifically mined from the Libby, Montana mine, and that's where asbestos was known to be contaminated in the ore in that mine or produced within that mine. So that cutoff date actually is early 2000s. So they use that material past the actual cutoff date. So that is an exception to the rule, which is, again, why I always say if you have a newer building, you can't make the assumption that asbestos may not be present. So this is a video of a non-friable material, and these are materials that maintain their integrity a little bit better than friable. So they may maintain shape and size, but they don't necessarily have to be hard. So a vinyl floor tile, for example, and I'll have a picture of that in a little bit, is hard, but putty or caulking like this person's holding here can be flexible or pliable or putty-like. So this is something that, although it may crumble, so a vinyl floor tile may become in poor condition, and you might have pieces of tile here and there, it still is non-friable because the fibers are readily bound to a binding agent, and that means they're heavy. So even if you crack the material or break the material, that fiber is not going to become airborne, and it's too big to become respirable. So when I say respirable, that means you're able to breathe in that material or fiber and it stays within your lungs. So it passes your nasal passage and your your throat or airway, and it becomes lodged in your lungs. So when I use that term a little bit later in the conversation, that's what I mean when I say respirable fibers in relation to friable material. So I've got a bunch of slides here, and I'm going to go through them a little bit quickly, but I want to show you some examples of asbestos. So if you haven't actually seen it, or you're not, really sure what components in your commercial real estate building could contain asbestos, I've included a lot of slides here that have examples of different types of friable and non-friable material. So spray fireproofing is one of those materials that is less and less seen in different buildings. Over the last 20 years, they've been really trying to abate this material and clean and remove the spray from structural beams and trusses and decks as well. and reinstalled with new. So usually new spray fireproof, more commonly than not, has kind of a bluish green tinge to it, which is an indicator that it's a new applied spray and does not contain asbestos, but it was used as an insulator, fire protection, and most commonly applied to structural components. The next one is thermal insulations on piping systems. So two examples, these are trade names, Aircell and Sweat Wrap. So they're insulation that works as a thermal insulator on different types of pipes. So hot water, cold water, rainwater leaders, excuse me. And the one on the right is a sweat wrap. So it has different varying layers of paper mixed with tar. And then Aircell is kind of corrugated. And I always say it's like a cat scratching post, that you would see that type of corrugation. And usually they're wrapped with a canvas, some type of lagging paper, or say it like a shiny tape as well. So they can be wrapped in different types of applications. So I want to point out parging cement, because in a lot of commercial real estate buildings, you're going to have these perimeter induction units, and sometimes they're accessed for maintenance, and you will commonly find parging cement on pipe fittings behind those induction units. So that's something to consider for some of your maintenance staff as well, that have to take off the covers of those perimeter units and do maintenance of any sort. And a lot of the time, those areas are missed as when I talk about the assessment portion, because it's a concealed area that we don't access for management purposes. And then May block is preformed insulation that is made in a factory and then to the diameter of the pipe and then installed together during installation. Then we have different types of thermal insulations in addition to piping. So boilers, we don't see older boilers as often, but it can be over boilers or inside as a refractory brick. You can also find it on ducts and large piping insulation or systems within mechanical rooms. So again, a lot of this has been abated over the years. However, it's always great, and I get excited and our technicians get excited when we do find an older application, such as this old boiler here on the left. This is a vermiculite insulation, so that loose fill insulation that I had mentioned previous. And this is found not only in commercial real estate, primarily in exterior or perimeter block walls or behind the concrete facade of your building, but also residential. So in the attic spaces of a lot of residential older homes had this loose fill insulation. And this is the type of asbestos insulation that you could find in the early 2000s as well, if you are managing or the property manager of commercial real estate that was constructed late 1990s, early 2000s. Acoustic texture finish is another big one, commonly in a lot of your common areas or washroom facilities, elevator lobbies as well. It's troweled on drywall plaster. It can be applied to drywall or applied to concrete deck directly. It can be friable or non-friable. Again, if we're unsure or can't access it to sample and determine, it's presumed to be friable on the air or err on the side of caution. Plaster is another big one as well, and more times than not in your commercial real estate buildings, it's going to be concealed above another false ceiling, so a lay-in ceiling tile and grid. So a lot of the times the plaster has become in poor condition or fair condition over time, and that's something, of course, that you want to hide from building occupants for safety reasons and also for aesthetic reasons. So you'll find that this plaster in particular may be present applied to the concrete deck above that false ceiling. It can be applied to concrete and metal lath, horsehair, and it can also be two-phase. So that's something to consider when well, for us in particular, when we're sampling, to make sure that we get all layers of the plaster down to substrate, because you can have a top coat, a base coat, a skim coat, and we want to make sure that we capture all those layers, because asbestos may be present in the base coat and not the top coat, and vice versa in different situations. I mentioned acoustic ceiling tiles. So although you may install a new ceiling system to conceal older plaster, some of those older 2x4 ceiling tiles, 1x1 ceiling tiles can be asbestos as well. Sometimes these 1x1s on the right are wood fiber, but visually sometimes it's hard to tell. The white or pink back could be an indicator of an asbestos tile, but not necessarily the only indicator. And I'd like to point out the mastic pucks on the right as well. So any glue that was used to adhere these ceiling tiles to the substrate could potentially also be asbestos. You've got some gaskets here, so on pipe connections in mechanical or boiler rooms. On the right-hand side, we've got a pretty deteriorated gasket around the entrance of a boiler, or I'm assuming which is a boiler. And if you look carefully, and it's hard to tell, there is refractory brick on the inside of this boiler system. And that's something that we do assess and sample as well. Could be asbestos. Textiles. So this is an example of vibration dampers. A lot of the times they're not sampled for management because, as you can see clearly on the right, it does cause damage to that textile component and may potentially compromise the HVAC system. So we tend to leave those as presumed asbestos in the absence of sampling. Electrical conduit and wiring. Sometimes if you do have hydro rooms within your commercial real estate building, some of the older conduit would be wrapped in this textile material. Sometimes it's visible, like this one's exposed, but you may have them wrapped in additional conduit casings or metal coverings with this textile underneath. And then I always say, like, if you own an older home, it's good to point out as well that you may want to do your own investigation. So if you have duct runs, you may find a paper insulation on the exterior of your ducts. This is a duct register where the top has been removed or the vent cover has been removed in the middle, and you can see an asbestos paper insulation around that duct. And then a lot of times as well in real estate buildings, you'll find this kind of heat shield, which is generally concealed under the lamp cover. But if you do see a heat shield, it's shiny on top, but there's that paper backing, which sometimes contains asbestos. 9x9 floor tiles, not necessarily only 9x9, but 12x12 as well. Vinyl sheet floorings and stair treads. Drywall joint compound, one of the common ones that is most top of mind when we think about maintenance or construction. Sometimes the joint compound is readily available, which is great, so we can see for sampling. Sometimes it's painted over or there's a wall covering, so you'll typically find it on the seam of the drywall panels. And then non-friable things like rainwater leaders, gray pipes, or cement boards, exterior soffits. This is a non-friable hard material, harder to break, but nonetheless still contains asbestos fibers. And I just want to point out that we do exterior as well. So roofing systems, this is a roofing core in the middle here, shingles, exterior window caulking, all of those materials based on the date of your building construction could potentially also contain asbestos. I've just included a little sheet here for the known cutoff dates for asbestos. Because Pynchon has their own accredited lab, we have a massive inventory of bulk samples that we data log every single one. And that gives us the ability to also see trends in the industry and in different types of materials and come up with more accurate cutoff dates for varying materials. So I want to talk about the primary reason why we talk about asbestos. And I always say, if you are the building manager, operator, or property manager, this is most important. You want to make sure that you're protecting the health and safety of not only your occupants or building tenants, but your maintenance staff and construction workers doing any type of work in your building. That's first and foremost, above anything. So I talked about the term respirable. So these fibers are very small, and that's with them being small, they get stuck within your lungs and they can't be coughed out or they can't be passed out. And because of that, they cause scarification. So I included a hair versus an asbestos fiber here, and there's quite a large difference. So you can see how a small fiber like this can become lodged in your lungs. And the next slide actually shows a picture of a lung or a set of lungs that has asbestosis. And this is basically the hardening of the lungs through scarification. So that little asbestos fiber eventually causes a bit of scarring, which builds scar tissue. And then your lungs don't have the capacity to inhale and exhale at full capacity if you were healthy. Lung cancer and mesothelioma are also two additional health effects related to asbestos exposure, but the lag time is 20 to 50 years. So if you're exposed today, you're not going to see results in a blood test or the results of that exposure tomorrow. You're going to see that in about 20 to 50 years. And then I've just got a little chart here. This is WSIB data that shows about 50% of the fatal occupational diseases related to asbestos is mesothelioma, lung cancer being the second. So now the fun part of the presentation, I always say it's the driest, but it's why we do what we do to satisfy regulatory requirements secondary to the health and safety of our building occupants. So because I might have attendees from different provinces outside of Ontario, I want to talk about federal regulatory requirements. So looking at the federal regulation, of course, applying to all provinces in Canada, we talk about the Canadian Labour Code. So specifically Part X deals with hazardous substances in Canada, and it talks about ensuring health and safety of workers and occupants in your workspace and how to properly manage and deal with employees that may have been exposed to hazardous substances and deal with the investigation and assessment of such. So it also talks about maintaining a record of hazardous substances, and I think it's important to point out that, and I believe I do have a slide on this, so I may not say that, but it talks about general duties of the employers, what specifically pertains to you attending this seminar today. So specifically in Ontario, we have O.Reg 27805, and this specifically deals with asbestos on construction projects and for repair or maintenance activities. BC has WorkSafe BC. Alberta follows the Occupational Health and Safety Act, for example. They all have very similar requirements, but they do differ. In comparison, though, I would say Ontario, and hate to use the term relaxed, but they're a little more relaxed, for lack of a better word, than British Columbia or Quebec, for example. We have different types of requirements. That said, between provincial and federal legislation, whatever is most stringent applies to that province. So if Ontario was a little relaxed with a certain procedure, whereas federal legislation was a bit more stringent, we would still follow the more stringent applicable legislation, which would be federal then. So in talking about 27805, specifically in Ontario, there is a requirement to maintain a record of asbestos for your building. So that's where in the next slides, I'm going to talk about the requirement for an asbestos assessment. So this includes friable, non-friable materials, regardless of building date of construction, and talks about the scope of the day-to-day management purposes for not related to construction, not related to renovation. So that is a requirement specifically stated under this regulation in Ontario. It also talks about the requirement to implement an asbestos management plan, which we're also going to talk about, and talks about the requirements as you as the building owner or operator to notify people occupying your building, tenants in your building about the presence of asbestos in the space that they're occupying. Notification to contractors as well. There is a requirement to provide them this document and have it readily available for them to review prior to construction or renovation activities. As a side note, the management assessment that I'm about to talk about is not a regulatory satisfactory requirement for renovation or construction. But again, we're not talking about that today, so I'm just trying to focus the conversation on management only. So just keep that in mind, that there are additional requirements outside of asbestos management for long-term when you are doing different types of activities or renovation or demolition. And then there's a requirement for having employees properly trained under this regulation. And it talks about some of those requirements. And I will too talk about some of those that you're required to implement for your employees working in buildings with asbestos. So an asbestos assessment, so section 8 specifically, and I've included these links here because this presentation will be available to you after this seminar. So if you want a quick link, these are 2 links that will lead you to section 8 of the O.Reg. And this specifically talks about the requirement of an asbestos assessment to test and identify for, if any, asbestos-containing materials in your building as you as the owner. So you have to keep a record on site or on the premises of your building that is readily available if you have known asbestos present. So that is a document that's more commonly than not is kept in, let's say, your janitorial areas or maintenance operations areas or main office security building, somewhere that is accessible and known to those who need to access it. So any work or performing work that involves the disturbance of known or presumed asbestos has to review this report and be given proper training to follow applicable safety procedures, which are also detailed under that regulation, O.Reg 27805. So again, as I just briefly mentioned, asbestos management surveys are not optional. So in all provinces across Canada, there is that requirement to do the initial survey and do your annual reassessment if you have confirmed asbestos or presumed asbestos in your building. So in Ontario specifically, it says every 12 months. So it does put that time requirement stipulation in there. And it also says at regular intervals. So you may have a maintenance staff doing it a monthly check or a walkthrough, and then you'll call in a consultant to do a formal report on an annual basis. This is different than the requirements for all hazardous materials. So this is optional for maintenance. You don't have to assess or reassess lead or mold or PCBs. Well, mold is an exception because you'll want to remediate mold if you do have it. But other designated substances are not a mandatory requirement for management. So that is optional. So how do you actually carry out, or how do you get on board to start this assessment and make sure that you're in compliance by having this mandatory documentation and assessment for your commercial real estate? So the first is to contact a consultant, reach out, provide them information about your building. So size, age, use, when we can access, is there any additional safety requirements in order to access your building, or certain areas such as electrical or mechanical rooms within your facility. So once you have a retained consultant, you set up site access, and we really like to have an operator or someone familiar with the building that has familiarity and also a set of keys to help get us in and out of areas. And we find that when we have building maintenance personnel or someone that tenants are familiar with, we get asked less questions, and the less we're asked by tenants, the better. And of course, we're extremely discreet when we are there. So if asbestos is a bit of a danger word, we try not to use that. We just say, condition assessment, because we don't want to cause panic or alarm to any type of tenant or occupant. So we'll go out, we will do a room-by-room assessment, we'll collect information. We have something called HMIS, so it's a Hazardous Materials Information System. And we actually do have a presentation separately or a webinar. So if you are interested in HMIS and the workings of how it could potentially benefit you and your commercial real estate, feel free. But just in sum, to keep it really short, it is basically a data management system where data can be collected, managed, referenced, and updated real time. We can upload analytical and reports and drawings to that system as well. So it's a really nice management system. It was designed by Pynchon, but it's actually used by different consultants to service different types of clients as well. So it's well known in the industry. So now that you have your asbestos assessment and the report has been provided by Pynchon or the consultant, within that report, we'll identify any remedial action or short-term requirements that need to happen and to make sure that your occupants are safe, materials are in good condition, and there's no concerns. So there will be a supplementary remedial action report if required, if materials are damaged or require some type of repair or maintenance. But secondary to that, in that assessment report, there will be, if you have known asbestos, the requirement for an asbestos management plan. So really, a lot of people do the assessment or reassessment and think they're done. But this asbestos management plan actually is a regulatory requirement and is always recommended as a follow-up to your initial assessment. So I'm going to say AMP because it's quicker to say than asbestos management plan. So the AMP provides information and procedures for asbestos management, not only commercial real estate, but industrial, retail, residential buildings, or portfolio of buildings that's managed by you as a client. So it applies to all categories of property, with the exception of vacant land. But when we're talking about asbestos assessments and national portfolios, for example, an asbestos management plan is not required specifically for every facility. An asbestos assessment is, but then you can create, if you are a client who manages multiple buildings across Canada, or you manage a national portfolio, we can create one comprehensive management plan that sets out you as a client, your overall expectations and management requirements for asbestos across your company, and then have different appendices for different provincial expectations. So you don't need one plan per building. If you have just one building, one plan, or you may choose to split it out per province. But there's a lot of components to the AMP and a lot of information in that AMP, but you definitely need a facilitator to help implement and roll out or carry these requirements. So I want to talk about what is included in that AMP. So all of these, and these are just a few of what's components of what's included in that AMP. So all of this information is put together to comprise your AMP, and similarly to your assessment report, has to be readily available on site in a known location, and also available. Everything's electronic these days, so electronically or through PDF accessible to your staff. And again, the AMP is something that can also be uploaded to our HMIS online database, or if you have an online database where you store these information, this can be saved there. So the AMP specifically outlines the responsibilities of the client or you as the owner of the building with known asbestos. If you are managing or being a managing agent, acting on behalf of the client or on behalf of the building for asbestos, the AMP would apply to you, or if you're an employer of staff working in buildings with known asbestos. So really the AMP is a management system to control disturbance of asbestos in relation to management, demolition, renovation, alteration, maintenance, repair, any other activity. It's basically the be-all book of information to help you properly manage asbestos at your sites. So it also talks about training requirements. So today I've given you a little bit of an asbestos awareness training. But as part of that, it may outline that staff dealing with or working in proximity to may want to have asbestos awareness training, which kind of talks about the exposure risks, how to find asbestos, the different types like I've talked about today. And then it also talks about safety procedures and emergency work procedures if there was an accidental disturbance or spill. How do you deal with that? How do you respond to that? In not having that information, it's kind of all hands on deck, everyone's everywhere. But if you have this information in your AMP, it gives you a step-by-step of how to properly deal with these different types of situations. It also talks about work classifications. So some of our clients may opt to allow maintenance staff or certain personnel or internal contractors do minor type of abatement work. So it may talk about type 1, type 2, or type 3 work classifications. Those require an additional worker training, but that AMP will also outline that requirement to make sure that whoever's doing any type of maintenance in your building has the correct training. So I don't talk about abatement or work classifications in this presentation, but as part of the asbestos awareness full training that's provided to occupants or contractors or workers, these are explained in detail. So when we're talking about federal spaces, so you may be an owner or a manager of commercial real estate where you have federal tenants occupying your space. So when I say type 1, type 2, type 3, I'm talking about Ontario regulation. Federal legislation refers to it as low, moderate, and high risk. But as part of that, if you do have federal tenants, so any type of bank staff, for example, they fall under federal regulation, or any type of government services occupying your space, there's slightly different requirements for managing and disturbing or abating asbestos in those particular spaces. So that's something to know, although I don't talk about it today. Just keep that in mind when you're developing your AMP with the consultant that you've retained. That's one of the questions that they will ask you is what's your building use? Who's occupying your building? And the creation of this AMP really is a joint effort. So although we have an overall template, recommendations of what need to be included, there's a lot of conversation, and you may have 6 drafts of the AMP go back and forth with your consultant to make sure that whatever's outlined in there falls within your client expectations or your specific building expectations. So it's not a document that's created overnight. There is specific contact information and management information that needs to be put in there. So it's not a one and done. It's definitely a working document that takes, 1 or 6 drafts in order to get all the information in there. So as part of the AMP as well, and some of the questions, come from your tenants or come from your occupants, we give examples in this AMP or draft up a notification that you as a client can use to notify your tenants that asbestos is present in their space. So this is a notice that is sent to any type of worker occupying space with asbestos. So you may have plaster walls or drywall joint compound on drywall or gypsum board that is asbestos, and you have that responsibility to inform or notify your tenants that there is asbestos within their space. And then to further drill down, you may want to provide what is permittable to do within their leased space and what is not permittable. So something as simple as hanging a picture or putting in a little thumbtack to hang a notice on the wall may not require any precautions. But those tenants need to know that anything additional or anything major, like taking out a dividing wall or partition wall in their space, that's going to warrant additional procedures because there's asbestos there. So this is just an example of an asbestos notification. It's a partial snippet of a notification, but it basically will talk about the regulatory requirements. You may want to go into detail of what's present in the space, or you may want to keep it a little more general. It depends on your occupants, and of course you don't want to raise concerns. So I always say, work with your consultant to make sure that the wording is smooth and what you want to portray and communicate to your tenants. This next one is a contractor service supplier notification. So this is something that you can provide to contractors or any type of worker that may be working in close proximity to or actually disturbing or impacting asbestos. So it may talk about removal and repair or sealing entry, minor disturbance, etc. So this is something that, again, a little snippet, but at the end there's a declaration form. So you get your contractors to sign anytime they're working in your space that they acknowledge the asbestos present. They know the requirement for that additional assessment prior to construction for all hazardous materials. And they know the precautions and training requirements if they are going to be impacting that within their lease space. And then from a maintenance point of view, you want to make sure that you have an emergency response plan. So this is, I apologize if it's been quite small here, but flow charts are probably the best way to implement this and showcase the steps that staff need to take in order to properly deal with an incident or a misstep in asbestos that's present. So, the first step is to stop work, contact certain management personnel. So here's where you're going to want to include contact information, phone numbers, a person that they can reach out to, and give everyone kind of a step-by-step process of how to properly deal with any asbestos that has been disturbed in your building. So although I've just outlined a little or a few of the components of an AMP, again, I just want to stress the importance of usually, and I hate to say that, but usually it's a secondary thought. So, it is, and I got to stress that it is part of health and safety. So if you have a joint health and safety committee or a health and safety rep, and this has not yet come across their plate or has not been a topic of discussions at your meetings or, at any type of level of management, it needs to become a conversation because you don't know what you don't know. So by providing them this information, you can start the process and reach out to a consultant to help develop these steps and help develop processes that helps to better manage asbestos in your buildings. So although I've just talked about a few today, again, you really can include whatever additional information you want in this documentation. And again, it has to be readily available on site. An example is when I was a technician and I was going to a site, I had to check in at the main office or check in at the security office and ask for a copy of their asbestos management plan or asbestos assessment. I had to review that, and more times than not, as consultants or technicians would be provided this information, of course, prior to our site assessment. But in the absence of that, we would have to go acknowledge that and actually sign the document on site. So as I mentioned, if you do have an outside contractor coming in to do any type of work, whether it's retained by yourself as the owner, a property management company, or by the tenant itself, they need to have access to that documentation and they actually need to physically sign it. When it comes to abatement work, again, there is options. So it also depends on your individual client needs and facility allowances. So you may have the requirement for tenants to retain an outside contractor and qualified abatement contractor. As part of this documentation, you can list the expected abatement contractors that have to be used for your specific building. And the benefits of providing, a short list of qualified contractors as part of this plan where they can look and kind of see the contact information and reach out to get quotes for work, for example, is that those contractors are trained, qualified, and used to doing this type of work. and they're not going to take any shortcuts. And they're used to your building, so they know the mechanical systems, and they know the maintenance areas, and they know, your HVAC system. So that's why it's these types of plans also kind of set out some rules and expectations for tenants, because although you manage the building, sometimes behind closed doors things happen, renovations occur or walls are removed, and it's unknown to you until that tenant actually leaves the space. So by making information readily available and having all this information at the tip of your fingers makes life a little bit easier and helps to avoid any, accidental disturbance or visits from the MOL, which we all never want to see, of course. So anyways, we're almost at the hour, and I wanted to leave just a little bit of time for some questions. If you have some questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will have a look at them. In addition, I would be glad to take any questions. If you're not comfortable asking on this platform, feel free to give me a call after this presentation, and I would be glad to certainly chat with you. So I'll give it a minute if anyone has any questions for me. Yes, Michael. So the presentation will be available through PDF as well for distribution, and there's also going to be a recording available. So we will issue both. They're going to be posted to our website and LinkedIn as well, so you can access those anytime to review information or access links that I've provided in the presentation here today. Right, so I did receive a question to my own chat here. So the question was, can you transport or move waste after it's been removed without any training or qualifications? So the answer to that is no. You do have to be trained in with asbestos awareness and worker training to actually transport asbestos waste. So, you can't have anyone who is untrained take HEPA vacuums or used equipment that may be contaminated or HEPA vacuums that have been used. In order to transport that, because you may have accidental disturbance or exposure during transportation, you do have to have appropriate training. And then in order to properly dispose of waste, you do have to know how to fill out transmittals in order to track and properly dispose of the waste at a disposal site that can accept asbestos waste. So another question was talking about the levels of remediation. So I'll quickly say, yes, we stay away from the term levels because levels pertains to like mold remediation work. So we say type 1, type 2, type 3, or when we're talking about federal legislation, it's low, moderate, or high risk work. So level 1 doesn't necessarily require containment or enclosure. It could be something as simple as a drop sheet, and then a way to kind of section off or restrict access to regular occupants to that work area. A lot of the times low-level work is done during regular business hours, and PPE is optional for the worker. So they don't necessarily have to wear the Tyvek or the half-face respirator. So it could be something as simple as, cutting a small hole into drywall. That's less than 1 square meter. That's a low risk work. Removing window caulking around, the window finishes is an example of low risk. Level 2 doesn't always necessarily require a full enclosure, but it does require PPE for the worker. So that half-face respirator, Tyvek suit, protective clothing. More times than not for level 2, we do recommend, or type 2, we do recommend a full enclosure under negative pressure. So that's drawing the air into the enclosure and being filtered out through a HEPA filtered system, air unit, or vacuum. And then level 3 is high risk. So that would be your removal of spray fireproofing, your removal of fibrous pipe insulation over 1 square meter. So in relation to friable materials, I will say in Ontario, the only mandatory air sampling requirements is with type 3. Level 1 or type 1, type 2 is optional for air sampling. It's recommended if you do have a sensitive building or occupants to kind of prove along with this visual observation that the work has been done successfully, but clearance air sampling in the containment in a high risk or type 3 enclosure is required by the reg. So just very briefly, those are the 3 types there. I will also put my number in the chat. That was one of the questions. Best number to reach me if you have any questions. It's not letting me send. So what I will do is we'll have that posted to our LinkedIn. So I'll also have my information there. And then once this slide deck is issued, you'll be able to access my phone number there because it's on the first page of the slide deck. So my apologies, I can't add it to the chat, but I will certainly have that available in the presentation. Another question from Michael here. So the question is, understanding a remediation report is required. What level is required for asbestos-backed ceiling tiles and vinyl floor tiles, as those are very common? So Michael, you're right. Vinyl floor tiles and acoustic ceiling tiles, maybe vinyl floor tiles more so now than ceiling tiles, are very common in commercial real estate. So for the removal of vinyl floor tile, it is a low risk type 1 procedure. So that means, though, that you have to use handheld tools and you have to use any type of tool that is non-powered or doesn't cause vibration to the material. So a lot of the times the tiles can be heated and scraped up with a handheld scraper. So that's low risk. Again, PPE optional. You don't need a full containment. You just need to restrict the area and, of course, have someone trained to do the removal, and the waste, of course, be disposed of as asbestos waste. Ceiling tiles are a little bit different because they can be potentially friable. So they're non-friable in place, but they can be friable if they're broken or debris is generated during removal. So less than 7.5 square meters of ceiling tiles can be type 1. So you might want to put down a drop sheet, wear PPE for the worker, and replace the ceiling tile. That happens with water stained tiles. But if you have anything more than that, or you have to break them for removal, you're going to want to go into a containment or a type 2 enclosure. And yes, the last question there, I will also have my LinkedIn posted. I'll add it to this presentation as well, so you can have that readily available to you. So we're just 1 minute to the hour. Again, if there's any other questions, feel free to reach out. Again, this will be posted to our website and to the LinkedIn as well. And last question before I log off: do asbestos training certificates expire? Are there any requirements under the reg for the training? That is correct. We always recommend, although they don't expire, there's a requirement for a refresher. So if you have someone trained 10 plus years ago, you want to make sure that they understand and are up to date with regulatory requirements. So yes, we always recommend that refresher course for trades. All right, we're just at the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. And again, I look forward to chatting with you all further if you have any other questions. So enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate everyone attending today. Thank you.